It's nothing serious. Still.
Imagine this. You're sitting in a cold, sterile examination room. You've been feeling sick for months, a collection of strange, persistent symptoms that have taken over your life. You explain them to your doctor, your voice full of a desperate hope for an answer, and they look at you with a kind, dismissive smile and say the 6 most terrifying words in medicine: "I think it's just stress." Today, we are sharing 3 true, chilling stories of what happens when the person you trust with your life refuses to believe you. The true horror here is not a disease. It's the quiet, soul-crushing terror of being disbelieved. It's the slow, methodical erosion of your sanity as a trusted professional tells you that the pain you feel isn't real. It's the self-doubt that creeps in, making you question your own body, your own mind. This is medical gaslighting, a silent epidemic where expertise overrides listening, and where months or even years of a patient's suffering are dismissed, ignored, and dangerously misdiagnosed. But what happens when that stress is hiding? Something far more serious? By exploring these real, terrifying accounts, from debilitating pain labeled as anxiety to a child's cough that was a symptom of a toxic home, we will expose the devastating consequences of a delayed diagnosis. These stories are a disturbing but necessary validation for anyone who has ever been told their suffering is all in their head. Now, before we seek a second opinion, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. Because you deserve to be heard, you deserve to be believed.
Are you sure it's not just stress?
Our first story is about a quiet, clinical, and deeply intimate kind of horror. It's about the terrifying moment when you entrust your life, your pain, to an expert, and that expert looks you in the eyes and tells you that the suffering that is tearing your world apart is not real. It comes from a woman named Emily, a law student who learned that the most dangerous monster is not a disease but a diagnosis, and that the phrase, "it's just anxiety," can be the most devastating and almost fatal lie of all. At 26, Emily's life was a masterclass in controlled, high-stakes pressure. She was in her final, brutal year at Boston University School of Law, a world of relentless competition and academic combat. Her life was a meticulously scheduled symphony of lectures in the towering Sumner M. Redstone building, of late-night study sessions at the Feynman and Pappas law libraries, and of a constant, low-grade, simmering anxiety about the bar exam that loomed on her horizon. She was a woman who was fluent in the language of logic, of evidence, of the verifiable, objective truth. Her body, she believed, was just another system to be managed, another variable to be controlled through a disciplined routine of early morning runs along the Charles River Esplanade and a diet that consisted mostly of coffee and adrenaline. The pain began as a whisper, a quiet, deep, and unfamiliar ache in her abdomen. At first, it was just a few days a month, a severe but manageable cramping that she dismissed as a normal, if unpleasant, part of being a woman. She was a law student. She was training for a marathon. She was under an immense amount of pressure. She was an expert at pushing through pain. But the whisper grew into a voice, a loud, demanding, and inescapable voice. The pain was no longer confined to a few days a month. It became a constant, low-grade companion, a dull, predatory ache that was always there, just beneath the surface of her life. And a few times a month, it would escalate without warning into a blinding, nauseating agony, a feeling she could only describe as a hot, twisting knife being dragged through her insides. It would leave her curled in a ball on her bathroom floor, her body slick with a cold sweat waiting for the wave to pass. Her life began to shrink. The morning runs she loved became impossible. The long hours of studying became a Herculean effort, her mind a fog of pain. Her relationship with her boyfriend, a kind and patient man named Ben, became strained. Her constant, unexplained pain, a silent third presence in their small North End apartment. After a particularly brutal episode that left her unable to get out of bed for 2 days, she finally did what her logical, evidence-based mind had been telling her to do. She made an appointment with a highly recommended gynecologist at Massachusetts General Hospital, a place that was a global symbol of medical excellence. She was scared, but she was also relieved. She was finally going to get an answer. The doctor, a man in his late 50s named Dr. Miller, was the picture of kind paternalistic authority. He listened with a patient but slightly distracted air as she described her symptoms, her voice a clinical, precise catalog of her own personal hell. When she was finished, he smiled, a calm, reassuring, and utterly dismissive smile. He began, his voice the smooth, confident tone of a man who had seen this 1,000 times before. Well, Emily, you're a third-year law student at BU. You're under an incredible amount of pressure and you're a woman. It's a classic combination. He leaned back in his chair. Stress and anxiety can manifest in very real physical ways. What you are describing sounds like a textbook case of stress-related irritable bowel syndrome compounded by severe dysmenorrhea. It's very common in high-achieving young women like yourself. The diagnosis was a quiet, clinical, and deeply invalidating blow. But the pain, she began, it's not just cramps. It feels different. It feels like something is wrong. He held up a hand, a gentle, silencing gesture. I understand. But the mind is a powerful thing. You'd be surprised what it can convince you you're feeling. I'm going to prescribe you a higher dose of ibuprofen for the pain, and I'm going to give you a referral to a therapist to help you develop some better coping mechanisms for your anxiety. He stood up, the appointment clearly over. You need to learn to relax. Emily, take up yoga. Meditate. The pain is just your body's way of telling you that you're doing too much. And that was it. Her months of debilitating, life-altering agony had been reduced to a simple psychological failing. The problem wasn't her body, it was her mind. This was the beginning of the medical gaslighting, a quiet, polite, and utterly devastating campaign of psychological warfare waged by a man in a white coat, a man she had been taught her entire life to trust. She left the hospital in a daze, the prescriptions in her hand feeling like a verdict, a judgment on her own faulty character. She tried to follow his advice. She took the ibuprofen. It did nothing. She went to therapy, where a kind, well-meaning psychologist tried to help her reframe her relationship with her pain. She started to believe them. Maybe it was all in her head. Maybe she was just being hysterical, a walking, talking stereotype of a stressed-out emotional woman. Her life continued its slow, downward spiral. The pain grew worse, more frequent. Her grades began to slip. She was a ghost in her own, once bright future. Ben, her boyfriend, tried to be supportive, but he had been in the room with the doctor. He had heard the confident, logical diagnosis. He started to treat her not as a person in pain, but as a person with a psychological problem. He would ask, his voice full of a gentle, loving pity that felt like a knife in her gut. Did you do your breathing exercises, honey? Maybe we should go for a walk. The doctor said light exercise would help with the anxiety. He was trying to help. But every well-meaning suggestion was another quiet confirmation of the doctor's verdict. She was the problem. The pain was not a symptom, it was a choice. The final, humiliating breaking point came in the middle of a final exam for her corporate law class. She was in the massive, silent examination hall at the BU School of Law, surrounded by 100 other furiously typing students. The pain, which had been a low, manageable ache all morning, suddenly and without warning escalated into a full-blown, blinding inferno. A white-hot, searing agony that made the world go black at the edges. She gasped, a loud, involuntary sound in the silent room. She tried to stand up, to get to the bathroom, but her legs buckled. She collapsed out of her chair and onto the floor, her body a writhing, trembling knot of pure, unadulterated pain. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in the bright, chaotic, and blessedly anonymous world of an emergency room. But it was not Mass General. The ambulance had taken her to the closest hospital, the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. A new doctor came into her small, curtained-off room. She was a young woman, not much older than Emily herself, a resident with tired but kind and intensely focused eyes. She listened. She did not just hear the words, she listened to the story that the pain was telling. She asked questions that Dr. Miller had never asked, not about her stress levels, but about the nature of the pain itself. The young doctor, Dr. Chen, said, her voice a firm, decisive instrument of competence. "We're going to do an ultrasound, and I want a full pelvic exam. Now." An hour later, Dr. Chen came back into the room, a printed image from the ultrasound in her hand. She sat on the edge of Emily's bed, her expression a mixture of profound and deeply empathetic anger. She began, her voice quiet. "Emily, the pain is not in your head, it is very, very real. You have a severe case of endometriosis, one of the worst I've ever seen." She showed her the ultrasound, pointing to the dark, shadowy masses that were clinging to her ovaries, her uterus, her bladder. "These are endometriomas, cysts. And based on the amount of scar tissue I'm seeing, this has been going on for a very, very long time. Years, most likely. Your organs, they are literally being fused together by this disease." Emily stared at the black and white image, at the ghost of the monster that had been living inside her, and she began to weep. The tears were not of pain or of fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated, and furious validation. She was not crazy, she was not hysterical, she was not overreacting, she was sick. The surgery that followed was a long and complicated one. The surgeon, a specialist at the Boston Center for Endometriosis, removed the cysts, the scar tissue, the physical manifestations of her long and ignored agony. But the resolution to her story is not a happy one. The disease had been allowed to progress, unchecked for years, all because of a single dismissive diagnosis. The damage was permanent. She was left with chronic pain and the high probability that she would never be able to have children, a quiet secondary theft of a future she had always dreamed of. She is left with a quiet, chilling, and deeply personal knowledge. The most dangerous monster in the world is not a disease. It is a doctor who does not listen, a doctor who allows their own, baked-in biases to transform a cry of legitimate, physical pain into a symptom of a weak and overly anxious female mind. She now lives with a permanent and deeply ingrained mistrust of the very system that is supposed to heal. She is haunted by the quiet, gaslighting voice of a man who told her that her pain was just anxiety, and she is left with a final and deeply unsettling question. How many other women, how many other people are out there right now, sitting in a cold, sterile examination room, being told that their suffering is not real, and how many of them are starting to believe it?
He'll grow out of it.
Our next story is about the most terrifying kind of gaslighting. It's about the moment a parent's intuition, that primal biological alarm system, is silenced by the calm, reassuring, and utterly wrong voice of medical authority. It comes from a young mother named Sarah, who learned that the most dangerous monster isn't a disease you can name, but the quiet, dismissive doctor who refuses to see it, and the invisible, toxic secret that was hiding in the very air her son was breathing. At 28, Sarah's life was a beautiful, chaotic, and sleep-deprived symphony. She and her husband, Mark, were first-time parents, their world completely and joyfully upended by the arrival of their son, Leo. They lived in Philadelphia, a city they had come to love for its gritty, historic charm. They had just moved into their first real home, a 2-story row house rental in the trendy and rapidly gentrifying neighborhood of Fishtown. The house on East Girard Avenue was a classic Philly row home. Narrow, full of character, with original hardwood floors and a small postage stamp-sized backyard. It was also old, drafty, and perpetually damp, quirks they had initially seen as part of its charm. Sarah was a freelance graphic designer, working from a small sunlit studio in their second bedroom. Mark was a high school history teacher. Their life was a constant, juggling act of deadlines, finances, and the overwhelming, all-consuming love they felt for their son. Leo, at 4 years old, was a whirlwind of energy, a bright, curious, and perfectly healthy little boy. He was their entire world. The cough started in the fall. It was a small, dry, and unremarkable cough, the kind every parent of a preschooler knows intimately. It was the sound of the changing seasons, of a developing immune system, of a dozen minor harmless viruses that are a normal part of growing up. They treated it with honey, a cool mist humidifier, and an abundance of patience, but the cough didn't go away. It lingered, a quiet, persistent guest in their home. It would get better for a few days, and then return. It was worst at night. Sarah would lie awake in the dark, listening to the small, dry, hacking sound coming from the baby monitor, a sound that seemed to saw away at the quiet, peaceful darkness. After a month, they took him to their pediatrician. Dr. Evans was a man in his late 60s, a classic old-school doctor from a practice affiliated with the prestigious Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He had been a pediatrician for 40 years. He had, as he liked to say, seen it all. He listened to Leo's lungs, a calm, practiced expression on his face. He announced, his voice a warm, grandfatherly baritone. "Lungs are clear. It's just a lingering viral cough. He's in preschool, right? He'll probably have a cough like this on and off all winter. It's a growing kid cough. It's perfectly normal. Just keep an eye on it." The diagnosis was a relief. Dr. Evans was the expert. He had seen it all. They were just new. Anxious parents, they were overreacting. But the cough didn't just linger. It began to change. The small, dry hack became a deeper, wetter, rattling sound, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his small chest. He started to get tired more easily, his usual boundless energy giving way to a strange, persistent lethargy. He would fall asleep in the middle of playing with his toys, a thing he had never done before. Sarah's maternal alarm system, the quiet, intuitive voice that had guided her through the first 4 years of his life, was now a screaming, "Red alert, something was wrong." They went back to Dr. Evans. This time, his paternal, reassuring demeanor was gone, replaced by a subtle but unmistakable air of annoyance. He listened to her detailed, anxious catalog of Leo's symptoms. He listened to Leo's lungs again. He said, his voice a little sharper this time, "As I said, Mrs. Miller, his lungs are clear. Children get tired. They get lingering coughs. Your son is, by every objective measure, a perfectly healthy, if slightly sensitive, little boy." He then turned to her, a cool, appraising look in his eyes. He said, using her first name, a subtle but clear shift in the power dynamic, "Tell me, Sarah, are you getting enough sleep?" Postpartum anxiety can manifest in many ways. Sometimes a mother's own anxiety can be projected onto her child. And there it was, the quiet, clinical, and utterly devastating insinuation. The problem wasn't her son's cough. The problem was her anxiety, her overprotective, hysterical new mother neurosis. This was medical gaslighting in its most classic and most brutal form. She left the office that day feeling a profound and deeply isolating sense of shame. She had not been heard. She had been diagnosed. The dynamic in their own home began to shift. Mark, her husband, had been in the room. He had heard the doctor's calm, confident, and utterly logical explanation. He loved his wife, but he also trusted the expert. He'd said gently that night, as they listened to their son's ragged, wheezing cough on the baby monitor, "Maybe he's right, honey. You have been under a lot of stress. Maybe we just need to relax a little." She was alone. She was the sole, silent witness to her own son's declining health, in a world that had decided she was the one who was sick. The next few months were a slow, quiet, and terrifying descent into a private hell. Leo's cough grew worse. He would wake up in the middle of the night not just coughing but gasping for air, his small body struggling, a sound that was a pure animal terror. She would sit with him in a steamy bathroom, her hand on his small rattling back, and she would weep, not just for his suffering, but for her own profound sense of powerlessness. She started her own desperate investigation. She spent hours on WebMD on parenting forums, a frantic digital search for an answer. She read about asthma, about bronchitis, about 100 other terrifying possibilities, and she read about mold. The thought, once it was planted, began to grow. Their house. The charming but old and perpetually damp row house. The musty smell in the basement they could never get rid of. The small, persistent patch of blackish mildew that was always growing on the grout in the shower. She bought a home mold testing kit. She took samples from all over the house. A week later, the results came back. The report was a rainbow of different kinds of mold, most of them common, harmless, household varieties. But one of the samples, the one from the air vent in Leo's bedroom, had a single terrifying and unmistakable red flag. High concentration of Stachybotrys chartarum spores detected. Black mold. She took the report back to Dr. Evans, her hands shaking, a feeling of grim, vindicated terror in her heart. She had proof. Hard, scientific proof. He looked at the report, his expression unreadable. He handed it back to her. He said, his voice a cold, flat instrument of dismissal, "Ma'am, these home testing kits are notoriously unreliable. They are not a diagnostic tool. Your son does not have the symptoms of toxic mold exposure. He has a cough, a lingering, viral, and completely normal cough. I am frankly more concerned about your level of anxiety than I am about his health. I am going to recommend a mild sedative for you." The final, brutal, and utter invalidation of her reality was a quiet, clinical execution. He had not just dismissed her evidence, he had used it as a weapon against her, as further proof of her own supposed insanity. She was left with a choice. That was no choice at all. She could accept his diagnosis, and in doing so accept that she was a crazy, hysterical woman who was slowly, methodically poisoning her own child with her anxiety. Or she could trust her own, maternal, and now completely terrified gut. The final terrifying breaking point came on a Saturday night. Leo had been struggling to breathe all day, his small body working so hard for every single ragged breath. Around 10 p.m., his breathing became a shallow, high-pitched, and terrifying wheeze. His lips, she noticed with a jolt of pure, ice-cold terror, were tinged with blue. She didn't call the doctor. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her son and she ran. She drove with a frantic, controlled terror to the emergency room at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia on Civic Center Boulevard. The ER was a controlled, chaotic symphony of life and death. But the young ER doctor who saw them was a beacon of calm, focused competence. She listened. She did not just hear. She listened. She listened to Leo's lungs with a stethoscope. She listened to Sarah's frantic but detailed account of the last few months. And she did not once mention the word anxiety. She ordered a chest X-ray. She ordered a series of blood tests. And she put Leo on a nebulizer, a machine that filled his small, struggling lungs with a fine, medicated mist. Within minutes, his breathing began to ease. The terrifying, high-pitched wheeze was replaced by a deeper, calmer rhythm. An hour later, the doctor returned, her face grim. She said, her voice a calm, factual statement. "Your son is having a severe acute asthma attack, and his blood work shows a high level of inflammatory markers, consistent with a significant long-term environmental exposure. The X-ray shows scarring on his lungs. This has been going on for a long time." She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes full of a quiet, professional empathy. "You were right to be worried. And you were right to bring him here." The words were a release, a validation so profound that Sarah's legs gave out and she had to sit down, a wave of gut-wrenching and furious relief washing over her. She was not crazy. The final horrifying truth of her son's illness was uncovered by a man in a hazmat suit, a professional mold inspector she had hired the next day. He found it in under an hour. A slow, silent, and completely invisible leak from an old, cracked pipe in the wall behind Leo's bed. For months, possibly for years, water had been seeping into the wall cavity, creating a perfect, dark, and damp terrarium. When the inspector cut a hole in the drywall, A cloud of black, toxic spores billowed out. The entire interior wall of her son's bedroom was a solid, living, and pulsating mass of black, furry, and utterly toxic mold. Her son had been sleeping every single night with his head just a few feet away from a biological time bomb. And the doctor, the expert, the man who had seen it all, had told her it was just a cough, that it was just her. She is left with a quiet, chilling, and deeply unsettling knowledge. The monster in her story was not a disease. It was a man's pride, a man's refusal to listen, a man's quiet and almost lethal dismissal of a mother's intuition. She is haunted by the quiet, gaslighting voice of a doctor who almost convinced her that her love for her child was a form of madness, and she is left with a final and deeply unsettling question. How many other children are out there, right now, coughing in the dark, their small bodies fighting a silent, invisible war, a war that no one else believes is real?
You're tired. Just sigh.
Our final story is about the quiet, insidious betrayal of a body in rebellion. It's about a man who built his entire identity on the foundations of strength and discipline, only to have that foundation crumble from within. It comes from a man named David, an athlete who learned that the most terrifying monster is not a disease, but the doctor who looks at your perfect, healthy exterior and refuses to believe in the quiet, desperate, and life-threatening war that is being waged. Silently, on the inside. At 32, David's life was a testament to the power of the human will. He was a man who had forged himself in the crucible of discipline. He was a senior financial analyst for Janus Henderson Investors in Denver, Colorado, a high-pressure world of numbers and relentless competition. But his true identity, the one that defined him, was not in the boardroom. It was on the pavement. He was a marathon runner, a CrossFit enthusiast, a man who found a quiet spiritual clarity in the profound, beautiful agony of pushing his body to its absolute limit. His life was a series of meticulously planned routines. 5 a.m. runs along the Cherry Creek Trail, grueling. Evening sessions at his CrossFit gym, CrossFit Lodo, and weekends spent hiking the challenging trails of the nearby Rockies. His body was not just a vessel. It was a high-performance machine, a symbol of his control in a chaotic world. His wife, Jessica, an architect with a sharp creative mind, was his loving but concerned counterpoint. "You're going to burn yourself out, David," she would say, watching him lace up his running shoes before the sun had even risen over the city. But he saw it differently. The pain, the exhaustion, it was not a symptom of burnout. It was a sign of life, a sign of strength. The exhaustion that would become his personal hell began as a whisper. It was a new kind of tired. It wasn't the clean, satisfying ache of a body that had been pushed to its limits. It was a heavy, leaden, and deeply cellular fatigue. A feeling, like his own blood had turned to sludge. His marathon times, once a source of immense pride, began to slip. The weights he could lift at the gym, once a measure of his strength, began to feel impossibly heavy. He started needing an extra cup of coffee from the Starbucks on 17th Street just to get through his morning meetings. His mind a foggy, disconnected landscape. He was a man who listened to his body, and his body was telling him that something was wrong. He did the logical, responsible thing. He made an appointment with a well-regarded primary care physician, a Dr. Harrison, at a sleek, modern lifestyle medicine clinic in the Cherry Creek neighborhood. It was a place that catered to young, healthy, high-achieving professionals like himself. He sat in the sterile, minimalist examination room and described his symptoms to Dr. Harrison. The doctor, a man of about his own age with a fit, athletic build and a confident, easy smile, listened with a patient, but slightly distracted, air. He looked at David's chart, a 32-year-old male, non-smoker, social drinker, excellent physical condition, marathon runner, works in finance. Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his smile a mixture of sympathy and a profound and deeply misplaced certainty. He began, his voice the calm, reassuring tone of a man, delivering a simple, obvious truth. David, you're a classic case of burnout. You have a high-stress job, you're training for marathons, you're doing too much. Your body is just waving the white flag. But this feels different, David insisted. It's not just being tired, I feel weak. And I'm always cold, even when it's warm outside. The doctor just nodded, his smile never wavering. Those are classic symptoms of adrenal fatigue, David. Your system is overloaded with cortisol from the constant stress. Your body is in a perpetual state of fight or flight. He didn't order any blood work. He didn't do a physical exam. He had made his diagnosis based on the data of David's life, not the data of his body. The doctor continued, pulling out his prescription pad. The prescription is simple. You need to relax. I want you to cut your running mileage in half. No more CrossFit for a few weeks, just some light exercise. Yoga, maybe. And I'm going to give you the name of a good therapist. You need to learn some better stress management techniques. The diagnosis was a quiet, clinical, and deeply emasculating blow. The problem wasn't a disease. The problem was him. His discipline, his ambition, his strength. The very things that had defined him were now being relabeled as a sickness. The medical gaslighting was so subtle, so wrapped in the modern wellness culture language of burnout and self-care, that he almost didn't see it as an attack. He saw it as a personal failure. He went home and told Jessica the diagnosis. She was, as he had expected, supportive of the doctor's conclusion. She'd said, her voice full of a gentle, loving concern that felt like a judgment. "See? I told you were doing too much. You just need to listen to your body and rest." He followed the doctor's orders. He cut back on his running. He stopped going to the gym. He tried to relax, but he didn't get better. He got worse. The leaden fatigue became a constant, suffocating presence. The brain fog was a thick gray wall that made his high-pressure job a daily, terrifying ordeal. The sensitivity to cold became so extreme that he would sit at his desk in the middle of summer, wearing a sweater, his fingers numb, and new symptoms began to appear. His heart would start racing for no reason, a frantic, panicked bird in his chest. His hair began to thin. He was a stranger in his own body, a prisoner of a disease that, according to his doctor, did not exist. He began to believe it. He began to believe that he was weak, that he was losing his mind, that he was a hypochondriac. His identity as a strong, disciplined, and capable man was being systematically and silently dismantled. The final, terrifying breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. He was driving home from work, navigating the heavy stop-and-go traffic on I-25. He was in the middle of a phone call with a client, his mind struggling to focus, and then it happened. A wave of profound, disorienting brain fog, so thick and so sudden that the entire world seemed to dissolve into a blurry, meaningless soup of light and sound. He completely lost track of where he was, of what he was doing. His foot, which had been on the brake, slipped. The car lurched forward, bumping the car in front of him. It was a minor fender bender, a harmless low-speed collision. But for David, it was a seismic event. He could have killed someone. His body, his mind, was no longer his own. It was a faulty and deeply dangerous machine. That night, he knew he was facing a choice. He could continue to accept his doctor's diagnosis, and in doing so, accept that he was a mentally and physically broken man, or he could fight for his own, desperate, an increasingly faint intuition that something was physically and catastrophically wrong. He chose to fight. He made an appointment with a different doctor, an older, more traditional internal medicine specialist at the UC Health Anschutz Medical Campus, a sprawling, world-class facility in Aurora. He didn't tell Jessica. He was too afraid of her gentle, worried disappointment. The new doctor, a woman named Dr. Chen, was the antithesis of Dr. Harrison. She was not a lifestyle guru. She was a scientist. She listened. She listened to his entire long and rambling story, her expression one of quiet, focused, and deeply serious concentration. She did not once use the word stress. She did not once use the word burnout. When he was finished, she just looked at him, a look of profound and deeply empathetic anger in her eyes. She said, her voice a calm, firm instrument of medical authority, "Mr. Thompson, your symptoms are not in your head. They are classic textbook indicators of a systemic and potentially very serious underlying condition. The fact that no one ordered a simple blood panel is a malpractice. She ordered a comprehensive series of blood tests. 2 days later, she called him into her office to review the results. She put the lab report on the desk in front of him. The page was a sea of red flags, of numbers that were so far outside the normal range they looked like typos. She said, her voice quiet, but with a hard steel edge of anger, "You are not suffering from burnout, David. You are suffering from a severe and profoundly advanced case of Hashimoto's disease, an autoimmune disorder where your own body is attacking and destroying your thyroid gland. Your thyroid is, for all intents and purposes, shutting down. That is the source of the fatigue, the brain fog, the sensitivity to cold." She pointed to another number on the page. "And you have a critical iron deficiency and severe anemia. Your body is literally starving for oxygen. It's a miracle you've been able to function at all, let alone run marathons. The fact that you were pushing your body so hard was likely the only thing keeping you from a complete and potentially fatal collapse." He stared at the page, at the black and white, objective, and verifiable proof of his own long and silent suffering. The words were a validation so profound it felt like a physical release, a pressure valve being opened in his very soul. He was not weak. He was not lazy. He was not a hypochondriac. He was sick, and he had been sick for a very, very long time. The final, horrifying truth of his story is not that he had a disease. It is that a man, a doctor, a trusted expert, had looked at his strong, healthy, and athletic body and had made a diagnosis based not on evidence but on a lazy and deeply ingrained, lifestyle-based assumption. He had seen a marathon-running financial analyst, and he had seen burnout. He had not seen the patient. He is on medication now. His thyroid levels are slowly, painstakingly being brought back to normal. The fatigue, the brain fog, the cold, they are beginning to recede. But he is a changed man. The fortress of his own physical identity has been breached not by the disease but by the quiet, smiling, and almost lethal dismissal of a man he was supposed to trust with his life. He no longer runs marathons. His running shoes are in a box in the back of his closet. The joy of pushing his body to its limits is gone, replaced by a new and deeply unsettling sense of his own fragility. He is left with the quiet, chilling knowledge that the most dangerous symptoms are the ones that are invisible, and that the most dangerous doctors are the ones who have already made up their mind before they've even asked you a single question. And he is haunted by a final and deeply unsettling thought. How many other people are out there right now walking around with a quiet, invisible, and life-threatening war raging inside their own bodies? A war they are losing simply because they have been told, with a calm, confident, and utterly devastating authority, that they are just a little too tired. A debilitating pain, dismissed as a failure of the mind. A child's rattling cough blamed on a mother's paranoia. A body shutting down, diagnosed as a simple lack of rest. These three stories are not about rare diseases. They are about a common and terrifyingly insidious kind of horror, the one that begins the moment a doctor stops listening. The true terror of medical gaslighting is that it creates a second sickness. The first is the one that is ravaging your body. The second, and perhaps more brutal, is the one that attacks your mind. The quiet, creeping doubt that makes you question your own reality, your own sanity. It is a profound violation of trust, a quiet clinical form of psychological warfare, where the person you have turned to for healing becomes the very source of your suffering. These accounts force us to confront a chilling and deeply uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous monster in the world is not a virus or a tumor. It is the quiet, confident, and catastrophically wrong opinion of an expert who has stopped seeing the patient and sees only a pattern, a stereotype, a diagnosis they have already decided to make. And they leave us with a final, empowering, and deeply unsettling question. In the sterile, quiet room of a doctor's office, who is the final and most important advocate for your life? The terrifying answer is, you are. If these stories have validated an experience you've had, or have made you determined to trust your own gut, prove you are listening to your own body by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us give a voice to the stories that are so often dismissed. But what if the horror isn't the dismissal of your private pain, but the public, brutal exposure of your entire private life? What happens when your name, your address, and your deepest secrets are posted online for the whole world to see? Click the video on your screen now as we explore the terrifying consequences of a single click. 3. True scary stories. Doxing, when privacy is destroyed. See you there, if you're not afraid of being found.